Not that many people have a fully realistic view of their childhoods. Most people, in some way, idealize, fantasize, distort, have illusions or delusions about the childhood they grew up in their family. If not that, there can be an active rebellion, in which case you think my family was terrible, everything was awful, and you're going to the other extreme. Being stuck in rebellion like that also has its own version of an idealization, or idealizing yourself as this rebellious individual. In either case, there's probably a lot of illusion if you were to really take a close look at the childhood in your family of origin, and if you were to really go through it all with a fine-tooth comb. For example, imagine that you were actually looking at somebody else's family and you were trying to be as objective and realistic as possible. And you would start at the beginning and look at, the period when the parents were planning the family, or however the family began as far as having kids. You looked at the process of having kids. You looked at early childhood, infancy, toddlers, all the way up. And you took a look at every aspect involved. At that point, you would probably have a pretty sober view of what had occurred. You would see a lot of positive, you would see a lot of negative. Of course, this depends a lot family by family. But you could have a whole list or a whole book of issues, of cool things and great things that were going on, of very challenging things that were going on. But this would pretty much exist in like a textbook form, in the sense of just objective reality. So the question remains, when we're looking at our own childhoods and we're growing up in that kind of an environment, why is that so hard for us? Why is it so hard once we reach adulthood to look back? And if you're unfamiliar with this concept, you might be thinking, well, I think most people, and myself included, actually have a pretty realistic view of childhood. I understand that it wasn't always great. I understand that there were a lot of problems, but I get it. I've looked at that a little bit. I understand it. Well, this is the kind of thing where the more you look at it, it's like the layers of the onion, and they just kind of dissolve, and you find one layer, and then you go to a deeper layer and a deeper layer. And all these things essentially melt away. But probably the reason why you haven't got that far in this process would be that you haven't understood actually that what you're looking at ultimately aren't layers to any onion about your family. That is, your family as a thing external to you. What you're actually looking at are layers of an onion of yourself. And the reason for that is because the entire family gets projected onto you in some sense. You absorb the lessons, the programs, the rules, the beliefs that have come with being in your family as a kid. You sort of inhaled them. They became part of the air that you breathed and the water that you swam in, okay? There's a word for this called enmeshment. Now, usually when people talk about enmeshment, they mean in especially problematic or especially dysfunctional families where it's hard to even tell where one person stops and the next person begins. Like, it could be anything from women are meant to behave this way, men are meant to behave this way. When we grow up in our family, we become highly respected doctors and lawyers. In my family, we take this sports team really seriously. There's a whole variety of lessons they could be, from overt and obvious all the way to covert, and the covert, subtle ones are the really difficult ones to identify. I mean, that's normally enmeshment, the way it's described, this very toxic process of kind of blending identities together within a family. So parents and kids and siblings kind of share almost a shared identity between them, as opposed to actually knowing who they are and what they care about. The fact of the matter is, though, whether your family is healthy or unhealthy, there's going to be some amount of enmeshment. And of course, there's no such thing as like a perfectly healthy family. So it's useless to even look for that. But what I'm saying is that anyone and everyone can really benefit from taking a hard look at their childhood situation, going through it with more of a fine-tooth comb, as I was saying, and trying to figure out where they might have received some kind of illusions or delusions that they haven't yet deconstructed. Now, one of the biggest ones, and what I'm going to get into a little bit now, really concerns the idea of the superhuman family system, and especially the superhuman parents. The idea of the parents as being superhuman, meaning there's something larger than life about them. Now, this is kind of a funny concept because we're not talking about Superman or the Avengers here or something, right? It's not that kind of a Superman character that can lift 1,000 pounds or something, or can run a 4-minute mile with no training. It's not this kind of physical prowess. This kind of superhuman actually refers to simply your psychological projection on your parents and what they mean for you. And let's kind of break this down. If you took that fine-tooth comb and you carefully analyzed your family situation and you had reality, and then on the other hand, you have your beliefs about your family, your beliefs about your parents, conscious and unconscious, all the feelings and associations that you have from that projected experience of childhood and early childhood. What would be the difference between this very sober, realistic textbook view of your family versus the perceived view of how it felt to you? The difference there would be a superhuman quality. And I say that because if you were analyzing other families and other people more objectively, you would be able to identify all kinds of behaviors that were good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, constructive, destructive, etc. And yet, those rules somehow don't apply when you're looking at your own childhood situation. Suddenly, you're looking at things that you might have viewed as destructive and damaging in another family, but in your family they were okay. Things like that, where we have these kind of rationalizations or kind of implicit rationalizations where we haven't even thought through it, and yet we're excusing certain things. We're not seeing certain things. We think we've processed certain things, but we actually haven't. That's the superhuman quality, which basically means the childhood becomes a projected story, its own projected narrative and its own projected reality. And this is actually very damaging to going on to living a healthy later childhood as you grow up and, of course, into adulthood. And it's so damaging because all these stories become ideas that become warped ultimately about ourselves. Because anything that's not correctly processed and not correctly perceived from our own childhood becomes an aspect to how we view ourselves. If you have a parent who's an alcoholic, but you always kind of joked about it and you said, there's some families in which you simply ignore the problem and wouldn't talk about the alcoholism, and other families in which you would acknowledge it, but you might even joke about the fact that mom or dad is always like 3 sheets to the wind. You might have made it sort of like this funny thing so that you wouldn't have to confront it more openly and discuss the lack of safety and the lack of guidance in the family. You might have had arguments about the issue and think you kind of processed it and healed it, how you had an alcoholic parent, but more likely you kind of turned it into this rageful ball, this like whole ball of wax that you never really took apart. So it just becomes a situation of projected anger. In any of these cases and many more, you wouldn't actually be looking realistically at the alcoholism in the family. You would not have grieved the loss of aspects of your childhood to that. And so you would be sort of in this state of having no choice but to look at your childhood and yourself as a product of something outside of reality. Now, that's pretty crazy when you think about it, but if reality is over here, you can look at somebody else's family and see some alcoholism for what it is, but then you're looking at your own family, and all of a sudden you don't look at it in quite the same way. Maybe you look at it very differently and you have different labels and terms. You joke about it in a different way. You have a way of approaching it with humor. You have a way of ignoring it or using denial as an individual, as a family. You sort of sidestep the alcoholism or you turn it into something else. It's taking your childhood and saying it's a fairy tale. And these things will always come back and stick onto your own identity. If there was alcoholism in the family, but it always became a kind of joke, then when you grow up and you're stressed out and you don't really know what to do or something's not going well for you, you're going through a rough patch in life, you might reach for a bottle, go to the bar on a Monday night when you really wouldn't otherwise, and start with 2-3 drinks. And before you know it, you're completely drunk. This might become a pattern of alcoholism for you, but you can't approach it realistically because in your world, substances are a Band-Aid. Substances are a way in which you approach difficulty, or to make it even more of a cycle here, how you approach your inner wounded child. And so your parents might have been doing the same thing with their inner wounded child, and now you're doing the same thing with your inner wounded child. So this is the multi-generational nature of a lot of these traumas and a lot of these dysfunctions. And the cycle repeats. There's so many ways in which this can happen, in which the stories and beliefs that you have about your own childhood that are not really about reality, when you grow up, they will end up sticking to you, and they become aspects to your identity that are only there because of the childhood you grew up in, but they don't correspond to true and honest thinking itself. What all this does is it creates a fantasy land where you lived in your childhood. And the supernatural quality to the parents really comes in because you see that a realistic view of the parents would have to shatter some of these denials, illusions, and delusions. A realistic view of the childhood that would take away the superhuman qualities to the parenting would mean that you have to look at mom and dad as actual concrete individuals who have no special status, who get no free passes, who are not characters in a fairy tale. They're individuals. And that is really, really hard to do. It's hard to do because it entails that grief of the parts of your childhood you didn't get to experience. You have to go through and you have to grieve what you didn't have. And that's very, very difficult. There's a lot of great material out there about doing this kind of grief work. And I also think it's really difficult to let go of this kind of a childhood and to sort of let go of these beliefs because it puts us in a place where we have to confront the nature of this reality as a whole. Because if we can look at other people's lives and other people's childhoods and see alcoholism, see narcissism, see toxic behavior on the part of parents, but then we look at our family and we can't quite put the pieces together, that means essentially that we're questioning what kind of reality we're living in, and we're questioning what reality is itself. And this is where it ultimately goes. Because when you want to truly deconstruct and bring down these massive statues, these figures of your parents, and take them down and see them purely realistically as people, I think that there's an element here, and this is a lot less talked about. I think there's an element of us that doesn't want to do that, because we get afraid as our 2, 3, 4-year-old childhood selves. We get afraid that if we do that, we're getting rid of the last shred of this superhuman, of this supernatural, of the magical. In the way that we live our lives, a lot of us, it's a 9-to-5 existence. It's a day in, day out existence. Things can feel like a slog. There's all kinds of mundane tasks. There's all kinds of little things that have to be taken care of, and it can feel that life is just an avalanche of responsibilities, what is often called nowadays adulting. And so in that kind of an environment, where does your inner child go for a sense of magic? Where do you go if you want to have a sense of true joy outside of any matrix system that we're living in? And there are great ways to do it. There are fantastic ways to do it. And that actually is really a lot of what the awakening process is about. Something else that people sometimes don't go into. Awakening from the matrix reality does actually mean connecting with the ways to experience joy and lightness. It could be going on walks and connecting with nature, joking with friends, making new friends, finding ways to engage in arts and creativity, gardening, doing things to get closer and closer contact with your own food supply, watching movies that you really, really love, or connecting with, entertainment that you really love, and so on, all the way to intuitive phenomena and talking to spirits, talking to angels, whatever it is that you do that's a connection to joy and connection to sparkles and magic, and rekindling that much younger version of yourself in the midst of this adult world that tries to kill a lot of these dreams and a lot of this magical possibility. So if you're somewhere in your awakening process where you do have a desire to look a lot closer at your childhood and you want to see it more realistically, but you feel there might be a block and you feel you might be stuck, think about how much progress you've made in order to connect with magic in the way that that 3-year-old version of you would see it. The 3-year-old version of you that might have been interested in make-believe, that might have been interested in dressing up, of doing drawings just for fun, sketches, drawings with crayons, your coloring book, playing in the playgrounds, running barefoot on the beach. All these things that our inner children want to do, that the child version of ourselves took so much joy in doing. Have you really connected with those things and found a way to bring that light back into your life and to expand on it and ultimately to make that the centerpiece of your life, that kind of a joy? And if not, this subconscious part of you is still searching for the joy. And if you can't connect to it in your daily life and you haven't yet taken these steps to kind of recolor yourself and recode yourself with something much more pure and magical, you have to find it in your belief systems. And this idea of your childhood and your parents is one of the easiest and most convenient places, because these are the beliefs and these are the memories we constructed as young children in order to make life work, in order to make it survivable, and sometimes in order to make it seem outright amazing. That's how powerful our young child selves were. The ability to actually take a mundane or even very difficult existence as kids and turn it into something really amazing, or at least something that was amazing part of the time. And we have these incredible memories of times we spent with family, friends, and relatives, and oftentimes parents. And even if it was a dysfunctional household and we have memories of some kinds of trauma or abuse, we probably also have a certain kind of infantile, sorry to use that word, but to confront it directly, an infantile fantasizing about the parents. And that's where this superhuman, supernatural quality comes in. We're getting our need for magic in how we viewed mom and dad when we were kids. Because at times when we would see destructive behavior, we would need in that moment, if you're looking up at your mom who's shouting and screaming in a toxic way and making you feel terrible, you need a way to transmute that. And that's ascribing all these magical powers to mom. Now we're really getting into the heart of this as I explain it here. If you are a little kid and you're looking up at your mom who's screaming and ranting and raving about something to dad, to someone else, to you, and you can't handle that because it's too scary to think that your mom is actually getting that unhinged. You need a way so that you can look at your mom as still being a good mommy and still being a safe person in your life. And the way you do that is really nothing short of kind of a magical act. You have to see this very toxic, dysfunctional, unsafe behavior as somehow okay and somehow acceptable. And so it's almost like you have the ability to kind of cast your own protective spell in a way, which is very sweet, and it is necessary as children. But this is really just one giant big coping mechanism at the end of the day. It's coping with the reality of a very difficult childhood with some toxic parents, even if they were only sometimes toxic, because every parent is toxic occasionally. We're human. It's your way to cope with that, but it's also a way to cope with a 3D reality matrix in which there's not a premium placed on joy and magic in the regular world. So as we're kids, we're trying to soak in as much of it as we can to have these really amazing transcendent experiences. Because the older we get, people are going to start telling us more about achievement, about getting good grades, about scoring the most points on our team, and then about making a lot of money when we grow older, about finding the perfect spouse, husband, wife, whatever, and it becomes the rat race. So you're trying to soak up this magic when you're kids. And one way that you do that is by seeing that parent as exempt from the rules of reality. And as kids, we have the power to do that. When mom is screaming and yelling, we exempt her from the rules of reality. And we say, oh, but it's actually okay that mom was behaving this way because XYZ, because she didn't really mean it, because maybe I wasn't very nice in that moment, or because it's just okay magically. We don't know why. And then 20 years later and you're a full-grown adult, you have to deconstruct this. Or 30, 40 years later, you have it, you have to deconstruct this and try to figure out what programs got inserted in order to create that magical script that you made for yourself as a kid, okay, in order to preserve safety and in order to preserve a sense of the possible. If you genuinely were to admit to yourself as a small child that you were living in a dangerous, toxic place where the most your parents were really going to do for you is throw you a coloring book, some crayons, while they got drunk and watched TV. That's a pretty extreme example, but that happens in far too many households. If you were to admit to yourself that they didn't really care in that moment about the coloring you were doing in the coloring book, they didn't care about engaging with you, they didn't care about sharing that time with you, they just wanted to give you something because borderline, marginally good parents are supposed to give their kids coloring books because it's what you get for, $2 on discount at Walgreens or something. If that's the most they were doing, you need to keep your reality held together. And so this negligent behavior has to become permissible and okay. And you have to see a way for your parents at the end of the day to still be loving, to still be guardians, to still care for you, to still provide for your material needs, and provide for your emotional, energetic needs of somehow creating a kind of almost a temple where the house becomes a temple of being able to kind of practice joy, practice magical acts, practice zest for life. And the way you do that as a child is by giving them this sort of get out of jail free card, for lack of a better term. But your parents get the get out of jail free card that allows them to kind of bend any normal rules of behavior. And what this does ultimately is it allows you to keep your reality together so that you can simply live as a kid, and not just reality, but sort of a super reality. It allows you to keep yourself existing in a place that still has a certain semblance of magic. And I would describe this altogether as the shadow side of magic. In this reality, we experience magic when we're open to it, and we experience the shadow side of magic. The shadow side of magic, in one respect, in this important respect, which I believe probably every kid does in some form, would be to enshroud your reality in this kind of magical cloud that makes it so that the people who are closest to you in your childhood still were caring, loving, good, and magical beings themselves who could understand your joy and who wanted to encourage your sense of joy as a 3-year-old. This shadow side of magic is so destructive because we feel it's all we have. And especially as we get older, it prevents us from completing our awakening process and finding ways to rekindle our own magic that doesn't need these scripts. So it's kind of like, it's a very delicate act. If you're going through an awakening process and you're wondering why you seem to be having trouble fully releasing some of these childhood programs, or if you just get this sense that there's something buried back there in your childhood and you can't quite access it yet, think about how much you are re-enkindling in yourself a sense of empowerment, a joy, and a magic of being able to do something that you truly love and smile and enjoy it. And if you're having trouble getting to that place, it could be because, if you're having trouble in the healing process, it could be because you haven't quite engaged this innate sense of joy, this kind of endlessly dynamic inner spark that you can keep it on and keep it going. So if you want a sense of joy, you pack up the bags and go on a weekend trip that you plan last minute, or you go out and look at the stars because they're so beautiful, just because you're looking out the window and you see the stars. You don't need a reason for these things, just like a kid doesn't need a reason to feel joyous. So as you build and reimagine and remember your connection to the spark of joy, it will give you the ability to do a little bit more grieving and a little bit more grieving of the joy that you didn't really get as a kid, that you had to kind of create for yourself in this shadow side to a magical experience. Okay. Thank you.